Witch's Sister by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 5. The doll lay buried beneath a rose bush at the side of the house. Lynn had stuffed it in an empty oatmeal box. Mouse had dug the hole, and together they covered it with dirt so the blame would fall on each alike. There was nothing else to do now but wait for the next awful thing to reveal itself. It was something of a hideous game, Lynn decided the next morning at breakfast. She felt sure that Judith and Mrs. Tuggle knew exactly what had happened to the doll, but could no more accuse Lynn of taking it than she could accuse them of sorcery. All were waiting till the time was right, and no one knew when that would be. Whether Mother knew or suspected was another question. Sometimes Mrs. Morley seemed to be in another world. There were moments when she stared at Lynn for the longest time, and then, when Lynn asked why she was staring, Mother didn't even realize she had been. Or Lynn would go into the kitchen and ask a question, and instead of answering, Mrs. Morley would turn and say with a look of utter fascination on her face, "I've just got the most wonderful idea for a book." That was another thing about Mother. Every book she had ever written was conceived with the same great rush of inspiration. The growing excitement, the tumble of ideas that kept her scribbling constantly on little pads of paper she kept about the house, always sure she was on the brink of the best book yet. But it never was, according to Mother herself. "It's not the way I dreamed it," she always said when she sat down with the completed manuscript in her hand, exhausted from the work. "But it's the best I can do for now." Sometimes she would say, "It's almost what I dreamed, but not quite." Or sometimes, "It's not at all what I had in mind." Like a composer searching for the perfect melody that was imprisoned somewhere in his own head, Mother was searching for the perfect story, always so sure at first that she had found it, and so resigned afterwards to making do with second best. She was at a moment of peak inspiration the day after the doll was buried. However, Lynn found her making heaps and heaps of scrambled eggs before she realized that she was right there in the house on Locust Street, and there were already enough eggs for a regiment. "Oh, Lynn, I've got the most wonderful idea for my book," Mother said, staring at the eggs as though she'd never seen them before. "It's about—" "Oh, no, I couldn't tell you. It would ruin it all. But I've got it all worked out in my head, and all the pieces fit together, all the loose ends I've been trying to sort. And I just can't wait to get going again. If I just had the time, I could do it in 3 weeks. The words are just rolling in." Mother never talked about a book she was working on until the first draft was finished. It wasn't mere superstition. She said she needed to keep that bubble of enthusiasm about her in order to finish it. And if anybody raised objections or pointed out flaws or frowned just a little, the bubble would burst. Better to keep it all to herself till the first sketch was down on paper, she always said. And then she couldn't stop talking about it. The day she completed a book, she told you about it whether you wanted to listen or not. "Oh, you'll love it," she would say to Judith or Lynn, whichever was handy. "It's about a boy who travels to Puerto Rico with his parents, but somehow he gets separated from them, and—" "I don't like stories about boys," Lynn might say, but it wouldn't stop Mother. "You'll like this one," she would promise. "You like storms, don't you, and shipwrecks, and—" The very worst thing Lynn could say to Mrs. Morley was that it sounded a lot like another book she had read. This seemingly innocent statement could throw her mother into a near panic. "What book? Who wrote it?" she would gasp and go flying off to the library to locate a copy. If indeed it was similar to the book she had written, she would spend weeks rewriting her manuscript, muttering about the nuisance of ESP or whatever it was that put the same idea into 2 different authors' heads. It was impossible to try to read one of Mother's books with her around. She would lean over the back of the chair each time she passed. You're on chapter 3, she would say. "Wait till you get to chapter 5. That's where it gets funny." Or worse yet, she would seat herself across the room, and if you so much as yawned while you read, or got up to stretch, she would say anxiously, "What's the matter? Don't you like it?" And so on. And so, on this particular morning, Lynn found the house activated by Mother's newfound energy. Everything seemed to be moving at a faster pace. Dishes were whisked onto the table and off again. Clothes were dumped in the washer and yanked out again. There were scribbled notes taped to the refrigerator and the cupboard doors on top of the mantel and next to the stairs. Mrs. Morley had every hour of her day allotted so that she wouldn't waste even a minute, and left for her studio early. It was no use trying to talk to her again about Judith. Any idea was like a new baby, and once Mother got one, she couldn't put it down. Lynn was lying lazily on her back on the floor of the music room when Mrs. Morley got home at 4. The afternoon sun came through the stained-glass insets of the bay window in just such a way as to cast a montage of reflections on the wall. Lynn liked to watch the changing patterns of sunlight. It gave her time to think. As soon as she got up the nerve, she and Marjorie were going back to the cemetery to see if the angels with the scroll looked the least disturbed, they and the grave beneath them. And then there was this horrible wait to see what Judith and Mrs. Tuggle would do next, now that the boy had joined their coven. What was a male witch called? A warlock? Isn't that what Mouse had told her? Mother looked at Lynn and immediately started to chuckle. Mrs. Tuggle told me about your visit yesterday, she said, kicking off her sandals. She said that her grandson took you by surprise, and that you and Marjorie ran home so fast she couldn't even introduce you. Lynn took her eyes off the reflection on the wall and looked at her mother. Her grandson, is that what she told you? Yes, I haven't met him yet, but she said he arrived a few weeks ago and will be here till the middle of August. So where's he been all this time? Lynn quipped. Chained in the basement? Mrs. Morley leaned against the doorway of the music room and stood looking down at her daughter. Now, what's that supposed to mean? Lynn sat up. Mother, doesn't it seem strange that a boy would be staying at Mrs. Tuggle's for weeks and Judith would be going over there every other night and not say a single word about him? Don't you see anything odd in all that? Don't you see anything odd in that at all? Well, now that you mention it, I guess it does seem rather strange, except that Judith is 14, and when girls are that age, there are a lot of strange things you can't explain, particularly where boys are concerned. What else did Mrs. Tuggle tell you about him? Mrs. Morley shrugged. Not much. She said he's shy, interested in astronomy, and is making some sort of chart of the stars from up there on the hill. Have you seen him, Mother? No, is he all that frightening? Lynn bit her lip. Mother, have you ever heard of bodily transportation? I mean a person sent to another place in time or made to disappear and show up somewhere else. Mrs. Morley slowly shook her head and her eyes crinkled into a full smile this time. Oh, Lynn, you and your imagination. You remind me of myself when I was young. Now what have you decided about that boy? You're going to have him scared of... Now what have you decided about that boy? You're going to have him as scared of you as you are of him. Lynn stretched out on the floor again. Nothing, she said. Skip it. The time would come when her mother would have to believe, when the facts would be so obvious she wouldn't ignore them any longer. What shall I make for dinner, kids? Mrs. Morley called from the kitchen. Hamburgers or chili? Hamburgers, yelled Stevie, and at once the kitchen was filled with the clatter of dishes and Mother's quiet humming. That everything should seem so calm on the surface only made the cauldron underneath more terrifying. Mouse, Lynn whispered that night when she phoned. Tell me exactly what the book said about selecting a witch or warlock for a coven and drowning him and bringing him back to life later on. I need details. Just a minute, Mouse said and returned with the book. Chapter 5, page 296. Though authorities in the matter have argued among themselves, most agree that every man or woman possesses a certain potential for power through witchcraft, but only a very few will be chosen to become experts in the art. A witch of the seventh power may look for a considerable length of time, even years before selecting another to belong to her coven, since the years of young maidenhood or manhood are the most successful for inducing a witch or warlock to join a coven. Youth of such ages are greatly sought after by the witches on the continent of Europe. Some in their search have mastered the art of murdering their apprentices and restoring them to life at a later date when there is a greater number to form a coven. Drowning is the preferred method of murder because it preserves the body without blemish. A person so revived has no memory of his previous life and is solely in the power of the witch superior. Mrs. Tuggle told Mother he was her grandson, Lynn said. Clever, isn't she? She must be getting ready for something big, Mouse mused. You don't go around pulling a guy up feet first for nothing. Maybe she figures that with both her brother and Judith to help, she can raise the cone of power and do almost anything she wants, Lynn suggested. Listen, Mouse, does the book tell how you can recognize a witch? Something that makes it sure? Mouse thumbed through the pages. Well, it says they keep the ashes from their spells in a little black box, rub their bodies with parsley and belladonna, slack their thirst with salt, and are partial to the meat of babies and young children. Again and again the same thought came back to her, and Lynn felt cold all over. Stevie. Several weeks passed. Judith told her mother that her styling mannequin was missing, but Mrs. Morley said she hadn't seen it. No one asked Lynn, and she said nothing. The doll was not mentioned again. Marjorie's parents had taken her to Ohio for 5 days, and she smuggled the witchcraft book along with her. Lynn spent her time watching over Stevie, careful not to leave him alone for long with Judith. Twice more, when she was almost asleep, Lynn heard the tinkle of a bell from Judith's side of the curtain. The girls said less and less to each other. It was obvious that Judith was seeing the boy she had conjured up, but she never talked about him. Instead, 3 or 4 times a week, Judith began going to Mrs. Tuggle's every morning, and sometimes in the middle of the day she announced that she would be gone for several hours. When Lynn asked where she would be, Judith replied, "Just walking." Lynn never saw where she went, and once, when she tried to follow, she found that Judith had simply vanished. The Saturday that Marjorie came back, the girls met at the dairy store on Linden's Corner and bought a 2-dip. Slowly they walked out West Road, licking the pistachio off their cones, glad to be together again. But Marjorie was subdued. She had finished reading the book on witchcraft and seemed unusually sober. "Lynn," she said after a quick account of her Ohio cousins, whom she found very dull, "do you think it's possible for a person to get in trouble just by reading about witchcraft? I mean, if a person knows a lot of the secrets of sorcery and everything, and then doesn't use them, do you suppose something happens to her?" Lynn shrugged. "I don't know. I study fractions at school, but I never use them. Nothing ever happens to me. Why do you think it would?" Marjorie's nose wrinkled a few times over her ice cream cone. "The last chapter said that if you summon the devil and you don't give him a task to do, he'll strangle you." "So make sure you don't raise the devil," Lynn said, trying to be funny, but Mouse didn't laugh. After they had walked a few more minutes in silence, she said, "Another thing they do is cavort in a 9-foot circle." "What?" said Lynn. "Who?" "Witches. They draw a circle on the floor with chalk and then cavort around in it. And they can't have any more witches in the coven than can cavort freely in a 9-foot circle." "Do you suppose Mrs. Tuggle knows how to cavort?" Lynn said. For some reason, the thought of the old woman in a high-spirited dance made her laugh, but Mouse was anxious, not amused. "Mouse, what's the matter?" Lynn asked finally. "Did you find out something in the book you're not telling me?" Her cone gone, Lynn wiped her hands on her jeans and faced Mouse. Mouse thrust her hands into her pockets and went on trudging up the back to the meadow along West Road. "Yeah," she said finally. "It doesn't sound so good, Lynn." "What, Mouse? For heaven's sake, tell me." Marjorie took a deep breath. "It said before a witch can attain her full power, she has to murder one of her younger brothers or sisters." Lynn put her hands over her mouth and stared at Mouse in horror. "Now I understand why Mrs. Tuggle killed her brother," Mouse went on, "and by drowning him, too. When he was just becoming a young man, she not only got her full power, but set the stage for bringing him back later when she needed him for a coven." Lynn couldn't move. Her eyes were huge. "Oh, Mouse, I just can't believe that Judith would drown anybody, especially Stevie." "She wouldn't have to," Mouse told her. "The book said that some witches manage to put their brother or sister out on the step at midnight on a night when there's a full moon, because that's when witches ride, and they'll swoop down and carry the child off. That's supposed to work just as well. I can see Judith putting Stevie out on the step, can't you? Or getting you outside at midnight?" "Yes," Lynn said softly. "I guess I can." When is the next full moon, Mouse?" "August 12th. Next Saturday. I already checked." "Then I'll sit up and keep watch," Lynn said determinedly. "Anybody tries to put Stevie out on the steps, I'll wake the whole neighborhood. Just let them try." And the girls stopped in their tracks, because there in the tall grass was a human hand, and a moment later, Judith's face appeared through the weeds. She was sitting there. Instantly, she scrambled to her feet and faced them, her voice low and strained. "Lynn Claire Morley," she hissed, as though intoning the name over a mixture of eucalyptus leaves. "I know what you're up to even before you do it. This is the last warning. If you spy on me again, I'll make you so sorry you'll wish we'd never been born sisters." Lynn was sorry already. Without another glance at Judith, she fled across the open field, running as though Judith had unleashed the devil himself, Mouse at her heels. They did not stop till they reached the south entrance of the cemetery with its huge iron gate that had long since rusted open and swung creakily on its upper hinge. "Lynn!" Mouse panted. "She wasn't alone. I don't know who it was, but I saw some fingers there in the grass." "Loose fingers?" Lynn bleated. I don't know, but they moved. Oh, Mouse, I'm scared, Lynn said. It gets worse all the time. The tall trees stood like silent sentinels sheltering the graves beneath. There was a haze in the air that seemed strange for August, warning of a storm perhaps, or something about to happen. Mouse, do you feel it too? Lynn asked, looking cautiously around, still breathless from running. Yes, but I don't know what it is, almost like someone else had just been here. I know, creepy, isn't it? Lynn's heart beat faster as they approached the grave with the angels. The stones of Elfreda Lewis and her husband were in the same position they had always been, but still the feeling remained. Slowly she turned toward the angels, and then she screamed. The two marble statues stood still and white as they always had, their lidless eyes looking out into nothingness, their long, graceful fingers carved into the edge of the scroll, which they held between them. Tied tightly around the neck of one, however, was Judith's yellow ribbon, as though someone had found it there in the grass and put it where the loser might find it eventually. But there was something about the way it was tied, with a big knot at the angel's throat, that seemed far too deliberate somehow. And as Lynn stared in horror, the marble face seemed to smile at her menacingly for one brief moment before resuming its somber pose. Up until that moment, Lynn hadn't really been sure. At first, she admitted, it had been partly a game that she and Mouse had enjoyed together, but no more. As the weeks had passed and one awful discovery had led to another, Lynn had decided it was a game no longer. Nor was it a joke or coincidence. The terror of what was happening replaced any excitement she had experienced before, and the one feeling that stayed in the pit of her stomach all day was fear. It would not go away. It was time, she decided, on Monday to talk to her father. Mother was so wrapped up in her book that she simply did not know what was happening with Judith. She went to her studio in the mornings, even before Lynn was up, and came home in the afternoon with the chapter she was writing so she could work on it later in the evening. Clothes were mended while she listened to the evening newscast. Meals were cooked in double amounts so that she could freeze a batch for the following week and save still more time. If anyone wanted to tell her something that took longer than 30 seconds, she would say cheerfully, "Come talk to me while I sort the clothes," or "Read it to me while I do the dishes." If she had been born with a third or fourth arm, Lynn was sure it would have been working steadily as well. And every so often, after Stevie had gone to bed, Mother would look up blankly from the big chair in the living room where she wrote when she was home and say, "That's the way I'll end that chapter," or "I wonder how this paragraph should begin." Mr. Morley was out in the street washing his car, and Stevie was there also in his bathing trunks, holding the hose so that the water splashed all over the car, and himself as well, his eyes tightly closed. "Want to help?" Father said when he saw Lynn coming down the walk. "No thanks, I'll just sit and watch you slave," Lynn said, and perched on the bottom step. She couldn't talk with Stevie around. Mr. Morley was wearing his oldest pants, a pair of basketball shoes he had inherited at college, and no shirt at all. He would have made a good father for Mouse, Lynn was thinking, and Mouse's father, who went to his bookstore each day in impeccable suit and tie, would have suited Judith and her immaculate sense of taste to perfection. "What's up?" Mr. Morley said, his long arm sweeping over the top of the car. "Not much. Haven't tripped over that Beasley girl's bicycle recently. Did she ever get back from Ohio?" "Yes, last Saturday." Stevie dropped the hose suddenly and his teeth were chattering. "I guess I've done enough," he said. "You can finish the rest if you want to." "Hey, thanks, sport," said his father. "You'd better go get a shirt on." "Your lips are blue." Stevie went slowly up the steps sideways, putting both feet on each step to see the wet imprint they made. When he reached the walk at the top, he ran as fast as he could to the house, and the screen door banged. Lynn went over to the car. "Dad," she said, "do you believe that things sometimes happen that nobody can explain, scientists or anybody?" "Sure, all the time." She hesitated. That was too easy. She had thought Mom had believed too when she hadn't. "Have you ever heard of bodily transportation, or witches raising up dead people to be in their covens, or children being carried off at midnight when there's a full moon?" "Yes, and I think it's a nice fat bowl of malarkey," said Mr. Morley. Lynn stared at him hopelessly. "But you said—" "I said there are a lot of things we don't understand," Mr. Morley corrected. "Just because something happens and we don't understand it doesn't mean that witches are responsible. Hand me that other rag, would you, Lynn? Now, that's a clean car if I ever saw one. After dinner the following Friday, Lynn found her mother packing a suitcase. She stopped at the door of her parents' room and stared. Where are you going? This is the writers' conference in Illinois that I told you about, honey. Dad and I are going to drive over there tomorrow morning and make a little holiday out of it. We'll be back Sunday evening. Lynn stared. You mean Stevie and I will be here all alone with Judith? During the day, but tomorrow night Mrs. Tuggle's coming down to stay with you. Mrs. Tuggle? The words came from Judith's throat with a shriek. Mrs. Morley looked up. Lynn, whatever is the matter with you? There was no time to lose. Lynn went on into the bedroom and shut the door behind her. Mother, she said earnestly, you can't leave us with Mrs. Tuggle. You don't know. Something awful is going on. This time Mother seemed annoyed. What are you talking about? Mother, I know you don't believe me, but Mrs. Tuggle is a witch. She's the one who's teaching Judith witchcraft. Judith has a candle in her room and a broom, and she does things with them. I know. And Mouse and I think that a long time ago Mrs. Tuggle drowned her brother in Cowden's Creek, and the boy at Mrs. Tuggle's isn't her grandson at all, but the boy who drowned, bodily transported because we saw Judith conjure him out of the creek and... Lynn, Mother's voice was stern. Now this is going just a little too far to be funny. It's not funny, Mother. It's true, and I'm scared. Now look, sweetheart. Mrs. Tuggle has been in this neighborhood a long time, and I haven't heard one thing to make me distrust her. You and Mouse are obviously taken with witchcraft these days, and your imaginations are working overtime. Dad and I have been looking forward to getting away for a day or two, and I don't think this is the time to bring up all this. You're perfectly safe with Mrs. Tuggle, and if there's any trouble, I'm sure the neighbors would help. But nobody knows she's a witch, Mother. No one would believe me. You're absolutely right, because Mrs. Tuggle is a dear, sweet woman who doesn't deserve to have her reputation ruined by two little gossips. Now, I want you to do your best to get along with her. You might even enjoy it. Lynn's legs felt weak. Tears came to her eyes. Mother, she said desperately, you can't leave me home with Judith. You just can't. Now, look, darling, Mrs. Morley said, if you and Judith are having problems getting along together, you'll just have to work them out as best you can. That's all. Really, Lynn, you'll be okay. I just know it. You're getting yourself worked up over nothing. Blindly, Lynn started downstairs, and Mother called after her. Oh, Lynn, you are so much like I was at your age. The stories I could tell. Someday I'll have to sit down and tell you some of them. Lynn did, however, succeed in making her mother uneasy. It's not that I believe any of her tales, it's just that I hate to leave the girls together when they're not getting along, Lynn heard her mother say to her father later. Mrs. Tuggle will be here to knock a few heads together if they get out of line, said Mr. Morley. She'll manage. There was silence for a moment, then Mother said, You know, we really don't know her very well, do we? Who, Lynn? Mrs. Tuggle. I mean, we've lived in this neighborhood all these years, but, well, we've never had her to dinner or anything. Maybe I don't know her as well as I thought. You've never heard anything bad about her, have you? No. I really haven't heard much at all, one way or another. Come on now, she's lived here longer than anybody else. The Edmonds left their children with her when they went to Europe last year, didn't they? Why don't you talk to them? I can't, Mother fretted. They moved away a few months ago. I wonder why. Does anybody know? Look, Sylvia, you've got to live a little. As soon as you see a nice weekend coming, you get the worries. Mother laughed nervously. Bring on the joy, she said. I won't think about it again. She did, though. Later, as Lynn was helping her mother put the laundry away, Judith passed them in the hall and brushed against Mrs. Morley. Ouch, said Mother, rubbing her arm. Good grief, Judith, you scratched me. Sorry, Judith mumbled, and went on up the stairs to the third floor. Lynn stared at the marks on her mother's arm. Mrs. Morley was examining them, too. Those are the same kind of scratches she made on Stevie's arm, Mother, and on mine, Lynn said. Mrs. Morley pressed her lips together firmly and lifted the stack of towels to the top shelf of the linen closet. All it means is that Judith hasn't been cutting her nails, she said tersely. Now I'm not going to say another word about this, Lynn. I refuse to get involved in this nonsense. Lynn went down to the living room and sat on the couch beside her father. She felt afraid and very much alone. Why the long puss? He asked, turning the pages of the paper. I don't think Mom should be going, Lynn said in a voice fairly audible. I think she should stay home where she belongs and take care of us. Your mother belongs to a lot of different places, and home is only one of them. You children are old enough now to take over some of the responsibility yourselves, and this gives her a chance to do some of the other things she likes. She'll be sorry if anything happens to us, Lynn muttered. What could happen with Mrs. Tuggle here? Father said, giving her a playful tap with his newspaper. Come on, old girl, buck up. Even Stevie's taking it better than you. Yeah, Stevie only knew, Lynn thought, and suddenly she remembered. Stevie! Saturday night. The night of the full moon. And that's the end of chapter 5.